Agorist. We should start by clarifying our goals. We both want to undermine statism and authoritarianism, but our methods die. As an agorist, I follow Samuel Edward Konkin III's philosophy. He argued that the most effective way to erode the state is through counter-economics, essentially engaging in all those voluntary exchanges and productive activities that the state forbids or hinders. This means building a thriving underground economy of free trade, mutual aid, and voluntary markets outside state control. By doing so, we withdraw our consent and resources from the state, chipping away at its power. Over time, as the counter-economy grows, the state's moral authority and actual power are undermined. Eventually, even essential functions like legal systems or security could be provided by voluntary institutions rather than the coercive state. History gives us hints of this working. Consider the black markets in the Soviet Union. Under Gorbachev, Unosiel Nalivo trading was estimated at $145 billion annually, with the majority of citizens relying on underground goods and services that the state couldn't supply. That parallel economy not only helped people survive, it eroded the central plan and exposed the state's inability to meet needs. The USSR's grip was loosened in part because people had alternative networks. To me, that's a real-world testament to how counter-economics can hollow out authoritarian systems from within.
I don't disagree that informal economies can undermine state control. The Soviet example is telling. But as a pan-secessionist, I believe economic resistance alone isn't enough. The state is not just an economic machine. It's a territorial monopoly of force backed by armies, police, and ideological hegemony. To dismantle state power, we need a broader strategy of decentralization and alliance building among all anti-statist forces across the ideological spectrum. Keith Preston, who inspired my view, calls it anarcho-pluralism or pan-secessionism, essentially a revolutionary alliance of leftist and rightist libertarians and anti-authoritarians against the centralized state and empire. The idea is that diverse groups, anarcho-communists, anarcho-capitalists, mutualists, libertarian socialists, dissident conservatives, regional nationalists, even radical environmentalists or anarcho-feminists, might set aside their errances temporarily to weaken the common enemy, the mega-state. History has examples of such tactical alliances. Think of the American Revolution. Liberal Enlightenment thinkers in New England joined with hierarchical plantation aristocrats in the South, and even sought aid from the French. Monarchy, vastly errant interests unified only by the goal of seceding from British imperial authority. It worked to break the empire's hold. Pan-secessionism proposes a similar approach today. Encourage smaller political units to secede from larger ones, regions breaking nations, cities breaking states, even neighborhoods asserting autonomy. If many such movements cooperate, the centralized Leviathan is starved of territory and legitimacy. I'd point to modern examples like Catalonia's push for independence, where leftist anarchists and Catalan centrists both opposed Madrid's authority, or various U.S. states nullifying federal laws, sanctuary cities on immigration, states legalizing cannabis against federal drug laws, etc. These show that fragmenting large states can gain support from unusual coalitions. Even Rojava in Syria, libertarian socialist Kurds carving out autonomy, only survived because of strategic alliances, initially with U.S. air support against ISIS, ironically. My point is, to truly defeat authoritarianism, we likely need mass defections and coordinated resistance at the community and regional level, not just individuals trading in the shadows.
I appreciate the emphasis on decentralization. After all, we both value power flowing back to local communities and individuals. But I question the premise that we need an alliance regardless of ideological alignment. Some of those far-right or extremist groups you'd include in a pan-secessionist alliance don't actually value freedom for all. They just want freedom for themselves to impose their own authoritarian norms locally. Aligning with, say, ethno-separatists or theocrats might replace one form of oppression with another. There's a real danger that in balkanizing the state, you'd end up with a patchwork of mini-states or warlord domains, little local tyrannies. Critics of pan-secessionism have warned exactly that. Dismantling the central state won't abolish other systems of oppression. It will simply create a power vacuum, a recipe for warlordism. Without a libertarian social ethos in each community, smaller-scale authoritarian societies could flourish. For example, if a white supremacist enclave secedes and runs its own turf, that's hardly a victory for liberty. It's a setback for the people in that enclave who dissent or don't fit the pure mold. You mentioned the American Revolution as a successful alliance, but remember it also left slavery intact in the South, trading one form of tyranny, British rule, for another, racial tyranny for many inhabitants. It took another war to uproot that. So I worry that pan-secessionist tactics could fragment liberation orts. One community's freedom might mean hell for its minority members, and meanwhile the alliance against the old state fractures into infighting. By contrast, agorism's counter-economic approach is explicitly anti-authoritarian at the interpersonal level. It's about voluntary interactions only. No one is imposing a new rule by force. We're undermining rule by making it irrelevant. When people start meeting their needs through voluntary markets, mutual aid networks, and civil disobedience, the state's edicts are ignored en masse. It's nonviolent mass disobedience with an economic edge. Look at the cannabis market. For decades, millions of people grew, sold, and used marijuana in defiance of the law. By 2022, half of U.S. adults reported having used marijuana at least once despite federal prohibition. This widespread counter-economic activity forced the state to retreat. Today, 3/4 of states have legalized marijuana in some form because the law became unenforceable and unpopular. That cultural and economic groundswell undermined the drug war more actively than any left-right political alliance ever did. It wasn't an organized secession. It was individuals opting out of an unjust law until the state's authoritarian policy crumbled. To me, that model, opt out, build our own systems, make the state obsolete, is the key. It's bottom up. And importantly, it doesn't require trusting or empowering any would-be authoritarians. We don't have to ally with reactionaries. In fact, we bypass all political factions by simply not playing their game.
I understand the concern about empowering local tyrants. But consider this: authoritarianism doesn't require a large central state. I agree with that point. However, a large central state certainly enables authoritarianism on a vast scale. I'd argue breaking up the gargantuan empires and nations into smaller autonomous units at least gives people a chance to escape or resist tyranny more easily. If one microstate becomes oppressive, its dissidents can potentially flee to a freer neighbor, or band with others to oppose it. Under a unified Leviathan, there's nowhere to run. You mentioned racist enclaves, but those already exist within larger states, often protected by state sovereignty. If we had a truly pluralist patchwork, an oppressive community could face pressure from all the surrounding free communities, or simply lose population as people vote with their feet. Essentially, competition between autonomous communities would discourage the worst authoritarian practices, because a town that, say, banned certain religions or enforced patriarchal laws might quickly lose talent and trade to more open communities. It's a bit like market competition. But with governance, people can shop for the community whose rules best match their values. Now, you might say that's cold comfort to those who can't leave easily, and that's fair. Pan-Secessionism isn't a utopia or a guarantee that every little polity will respect liberty. It's a strategy to break the major concentrations of power that currently prop up authoritarianism globally. Think of how many oppressive regimes are bolstered by superpower patronage or global finance systems, all tied to state structures. Dismantling those large structures is necessary to empower local self-determination. And crucially, I'm not suggesting we endorse the reactionary views of some allies. It's more like a coalition of convenience. We might march separately but strike together, to use an old phrase. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had Russian free market liberals, Baltic nationalists, Ukrainian Democrats, and others, all acting to pull apart the USSR. Some of those factions later disagreed sharply, and yes, some new states had troubled politics, but the common oppressor, the Soviet state, was removed, which was a precondition for any further progress. Similarly, take anti-war activism in the 2000s. Libertarians from the Ron Paul camp stood alongside left-wing pacifists to oppose U.S. wars. They didn't share broader agendas, but that alliance amplified the pressure on the Bush administration from multiple angles. My worry about agorism is that it can be too isolating and individualistic. You celebrate people ignoring laws individually, which is fine, but can this alone check the militarized might of states? The war on drugs, for example, you noted people defied it, and ultimately we see legalization creeping in. But for decades, that black market defiance also led to the state doubling down with brutal crackdowns, mass incarceration, militarized police, entire communities primarily poor and of color devastated by enforcement, even as the trade continued. The market continued, yes, but at a tremendous human cost inflicted by the state. It wasn't until organized social movements and state-level political campaigns joined the fight that we got reforms. In other words, we needed a collective public challenge to the laws, not just quiet evasion, to roll back that authoritarian policy. Likewise, in many authoritarian countries, simply operating a black market can be extremely dangerous. Think of activists in China or Iran who try to do things under the radar. Without broader solidarity and sometimes outright confrontation, they often get crushed by the secret police. Geopolitical power structures like nationalism, militarism, imperialism, these thrive even if people trade the books. The U.S. government can fund a vast military and surveillance apparatus, an above-ground taxed economy, and a black market in one sector, drugs or crypto won't stop it from building bombs. So, I see strategic alliances and coordinated secession as a way to mount a direct challenge to the state's territorial control and legitimacy, complementing those economic acts of resistance. It's not either or. I'm not against counter-economics at all. I just think by itself it might nibble at the margins, while the state still commands armies and unifies against us. We need something like a general strike against the state at all levels: economic, political, cultural. Pan-Secessionism is basically calling for a mass withdrawal of entire communities from the authority of the state, a lateral collective version of opting out. Instead of just individuals dodging taxes or trading secretly, imagine cities and counties openly nullifying federal laws, networks of communities refusing cooperation with central authorities. Sanctuary cities are a small-scale example. That kind of open defiance is harder for the state to deal with than scattered underground actors. It presents the state with multiple fronts of refusal. They can crush one underground entrepreneur easily, but can they crush 1,000 towns declaring autonomy simultaneously? Especially if those towns come from all across the ideological spectrum, confusing the state's usual divide and conquer narrative.
Those are compelling points. I certainly don't claim that counter-economics alone will magically topple a superpower without resistance. The state will fight back. History shows that too. The war on drugs toll that you mentioned is a sobering reminder. Simply having a black market isn't a pain-free path. However, I'd argue that any path to liberty will provoke state violence, whether it's secession, protest, or black markets. The question is which strategy builds more strength and resilience on our side while minimizing unnecessary risks. You suggest coordinated secession gives people a refuge and strength in numbers. True, a town or region openly defying the feds has a visibility and maybe a moral force that lone individuals lack. But it also paints a target. History has grim examples. The Paris Commune of 1871 was essentially a city seceding in the name of freedom, and the French state massacred tens of thousands to retake it. Or more recently, Waco in 1993, a small religious community defying federal orders got brutally crushed by ATF and FBI tanks. An isolated town in open rebellion can be wiped out militarily. Many simultaneous would be needed, as you say, but coordinating that is very DI cult. And if it fails, you've concentrated the state's wrath on identifiable communities. Agorism, in contrast, encourages a more distributed, networked resistance that's harder to pinpoint. It's a bit like guerrilla warfare versus conventional lines. The counter-economy is DI use, millions of acts of disobedience happening quietly. Yes, the state will enforce where it can, but consider how overstretched enforcement gets when defiance is ubiquitous. You brought up China and Iran. Interestingly, those regimes are challenged by widespread underground activity. Iranians bypass censorship with black market satellite internet and currency controls with informal trading. Chinese citizens evade the one-party system's rules through things like informal finance, VPN internet access, unregistered churches, etc. These haven't toppled those regimes yet, but they do create pressure in spaces of freedom. And often they are paired with bursts of open protest when the moment is right, which might align with your idea of a general strike. My point is, the counter-economy lays the groundwork by building alternative networks and undermining compliance, so that when open confrontation comes, the state is already weakened economically and socially. Even in secession scenarios, an undercurrent of agorism can be crucial. For example, you mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union. Alongside nationalist movements, there was also a massive informal economy and widespread civil disobedience, like the refusal of soldiers to prop up the hardliners during the 1991 coup. People had halfway exited the system already, so the union fell relatively quickly. I also want to address the claim that agorism is overly individualistic or ignores social issues. Konkin's vision wasn't just individual wheelers and dealers in isolation. He included all acts of forbidden association in the counter-economy. That means, for instance, interracial cooperation in segregation times, underground queer communities under anti-LGBT laws, feminist mutual aid where patriarchy or the church forbade women's independence. Those are all counter-economic in the sense of defying the cultural authoritarianism enforced by the state. Agorism, especially in its left-libertarian interpretation, absolutely values solidarity and mutual aid. Remember, we draw from mutualism and classical anarchism too. Thinkers like Proudhon or Kropotkin, who emphasized cooperative action. Modern agorists often support alternative institutions, community credit unions, worker cooperatives, mutual aid networks, cryptocurrencies, homeschool co-ops. Many aren't just about profit, but about autonomy and empowerment of oppressed groups. Take the example of the 2001 Argentina economic crisis. When the state banking system collapsed, around 6 million people turned to barter networks to survive. Entire communities self-organized barter clubs and created their own informal currency. That's counter-economics on a huge collective scale, driven by solidarity and hardship. It helped people weather the storm without relying on a failing state. And it wasn't just individualistic hustling, it was a community fabric. So I'd argue agorism can scale from the individual to the community naturally. It's not either stealth or open resistance, it's a continuum. We start by not asking permission to be free in our everyday lives, trading, creating, sharing outside state purview. As those free zones expand, like the barter clubs, like crypto communities, like DIY mutual aid during disasters, we are building dual power. At some point, yes, that could crescendo into something like a general strike or a de facto secession. But by then, the state's support has eroded and large alliances might form organically around the already existing new economy. I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not against voluntary alliances, I just think they work best when they grow bottom-up from authentic common interests, not top-down by yoking together wildly disparate groups who share only an enemy. The latter can be unstable or morally compromising. The former, organic alliances, we see all the time. For instance, localists on left and right teaming up to oppose a new federal surveillance program, or environmental anarchists and property rights libertarians, both resisting an eminent domain pipeline project. These happen without a formal pan-secession banner. They happen because each side's counter-establishment eorts intersect. I trust that process more than a grand coalition plan.
Those are good clarifications. It seems we agree on the endgame, a society freed from centralized coercion, and even on many of the intermediate tactics. We both see value in widespread noncompliance, building alternate institutions, and even eventual coordinated defiance. Perhaps the difference is emphasis. You emphasize economic and social self-liberation here and now, essentially quietly building the new society within the shell of the old, until the old shell crumbles. I emphasize political and strategic coordination, rallying all who resist the state's dominance to make a decisive break. In practice, these can complement each other. Indeed, you noted, the groundwork laid by counter-economics can make secessionist movements stronger and more viable. Conversely, the safety of autonomous zones could make it easier for counter-economies to flourish without repression. Maybe think of it this way. Agorism is like water slowly eroding the stone of statism, and pan-secessionism is like a hammer to crack it. Both together might shatter authoritarian structures into dust. But I do maintain, without some conscious strategy to unite anti-authoritarians, we risk siloing our eorts. The state often exploits our ideological divisions, e.g., portraying anti-war leftists as unpatriotic, while dismissing libertarians as selfish, keeping each group small and inactive. When diverse anti-state factions present a united front even temporarily, it confuses that narrative and expands the movement's reach. Look at how mass protests sometimes succeed. When you have everyone from labor unions to libertarian gun owners to racial justice activists all in the streets for a common cause, say, against a corrupt government or an unjust law. The powers that be struggle to marginalize the movement because it's clearly not just one faction. In that sense, a pan-secession alliance is also about optics and legitimacy, showing that opposition to statism isn't a fringe quirk of one ideology, but a widespread sentiment. You raised valid worries about yoking together groups with only an enemy in common. That can indeed be precarious. It puts a burden on our movement culture to insist that anti-statism doesn't mean we tolerate bigotry or new oppressions. Perhaps this is where left anarchist principles must remain at the core. Even as we partner with, say, a traditionalist community to help them gain autonomy, we can share ideas on why internal authoritarianism is harmful. It's a delicate balance, respecting their freedom to choose their way of life, while hoping the overall spirit of liberty is contagious. Honestly, in a fully decentralized world, I suspect many oppressive micro-regimes would moderate over time due to contact with freer communities and the loss of a common big bad to fight. It's harder to maintain, for example, extreme patriarchal control when women can move to the next town for better opportunities. The existence of choices tends to liberalize things. Consider how the internet, a decentralized network, has undermined a lot of old social controls by exposing people to alternatives. In any event, principled non-participation in the state, which you advocate, and principled disaffiliation from the state, which I advocate, are siblings. We both encourage people to withdraw their consent. Whether one does it quietly via counter-economic lifestyle, or loudly via political divorce secession, might depend on context. I think even you would agree that if, say, tomorrow California, or Catalonia, or Scotland had a chance to peacefully secede, that would strike a huge blow to the prestige of nation-states, and open space for more agorist experimentation in those places. And I would agree that if tomorrow millions more people started using alternative currencies, 3D printing unregistered firearms, running mutual aid clinics, and ignoring regulations, It would likewise strike a blow and empower local autonomy. Ultimately, we're both advocating decentralized voluntary alternatives to the centralized coercive system. Perhaps the errance is philosophical. You have more faith in emergent order through free exchange, while I stress coordinated action to dismantle power structures. But these aren't mutually exclusive, they're errant phases of a free society in the making.
Beautifully put. I think we found a lot of common ground despite our initial framing as a debate. To wrap up my side, I remain convinced that counter-economics, the use of voluntary markets, gray-black market entrepreneurship, and civil disobedience is the key catalyst for change. It directly starves the state of control and resources by inviting people to fulfill their needs and wants outside the statist framework. It's also something people can start doing immediately, without waiting for a mass movement. You opt out to the extent you can, work the books rather than pay war taxes, use crypto or barter to escape central bank debasement. Form a neighborhood watch, or hire mutual aid security rather than depend on corrupt police. Grow your own food, or buy from local farms to dodge state supply chains, etc. These actions, multiplied across society, build the new free economy. And as that grows, the old authoritarian systems shrink in relevance. A peaceful evolution towards anarchism. I do heed your warning, though. We should be mindful of broader structures of oppression, corporate power, cultural hierarchies. Many of us agorists are, in fact, left libertarians who view state and corporate power as intertwined. We seek to dismantle both by removing state privileges that prop up corporate monopolies. Without the state granting special rights, subsidizing industries, enforcing unfair property claims, etc., we expect a freed market to be more equitable and less prone to hierarchy. But we can't just assume all injustices solve themselves. We have to live our values in the counter-economy, practicing mutual respect, equality, and solidarity in our voluntary dealings. That way, the culture of the counter-society is libertarian in the fullest sense, socially and economically. So yes, let's keep those principles core. And as we each do our part, whether it's agorists subverting the system from within, or pan-secessionists uniting communities to exit the system, we move toward the same horizon, a world where authoritarianism has no foothold because people have routed around it and built something freer.
Well said. To conclude from my end, I remain convinced that pan-secessionism, encouraging many kinds of communities to claim autonomy and cooperating across ideologies to weaken the state, is a crucial strategy in the fight against statism. It directly attacks the primary source of authoritarian power, the centralized state structure itself, by pulling it apart piece by piece. It's about striking at the political legitimacy of the state. Every successful secession or nullification, every alliance of unlikely partners that defies a federal law or imperial decree, sends the message that people do not need a distant authority ruling over them. It's inherently decentralized and pluralistic. It says there's not one correct model for everyone. Let 100 communities bloom. This pluralism, I believe, can actually be a strength. It allows far more people to get on board with anti-statism, because they don't have to subscribe to one ideology's endgame, they just have to want self-determination. And as you noted, once that self-determination is achieved, the conversation shifts to, how do we run our community freely? Which is where all the counter-economic and mutual aid practices you champion will be invaluable. I'll also stress that solidarity and vigilance are necessary, so that liberation from the state truly leads to freedom for individuals. We must support those within any new autonomous zones, who push for more liberty and challenge any emerging local tyrants. Essentially, the struggle continues even after secession, but on a smaller, more human scale, which is a fight we have a better chance to win. In the end, we likely need both approaches, the subversive creation of free spaces through agorism, and the assertive break from authority through pan-secessionism. If our discussion here is any indication, anarchists of errant stripes can indeed find common cause without abandoning our core values. By combining the power of markets and mutual aid with the power of solidarity and collective action, we attack statism on all fronts. The state is a multi-headed hydra. Economic control, military force, cultural dominance, and it will take a diverse, multi-pronged resistance to slay it. I'm heartened that, despite nuances, we are fighting for the same freer future. Let 1,000 free communities and 1,000,000 counter-economic ventures bloom, and may they support each other against any form of tyranny. That's how we beat authoritarianism, by living freedom and defending each other's freedom, together.